Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast, made for women who want their healthiest years to be ahead of them, not behind them. Join your host, Courtney Townley, right now as she breaks down the fairy tale health story you have been chasing all of your life into sensible action steps and lasting change. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast. This is your host, Courtney Townley. As always, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here with me. It means the world, and I certainly hope you reap a lot of value from today's episode. Now, just before we go into the content of today, I want to remind you that I am currently running a free masterclass, and as of the air date of this episode, we have one more remaining, which is on the 17th of September. And if you want to check that masterclass out, it's all about consistency and how behavior change actually happens. You can head on over to graceandgrit.com/make-it-stick. Once again, that is graceandgrit.com/make-it-stick. And I also want to give a little plug here to our consistency code program, which really is the meat and potatoes of what I bestow on all of my clients who work with me. It is really 4 fundamental practices that I believe make every woman's journey to improved health so much easier, regardless of what kind of protocol you follow for food, regardless of what you do for exercise. Your preferences around diet and exercise really don't matter in this program. This program really teaches women the practice of awareness, the practice of organizing themselves, the practice of follow through, and the practice of realignment. And again, it's a 4-week program. It's priced just under $300. And if you are someone who has long wanted to work with me, but just really either can't afford private coaching or aren't really looking for private coaching, I definitely encourage you to check out this program, which you can do over at the website, graceandgrit.com. Just go to our programs page and scroll down to the consistency code. So this month on the podcast, we are diving all into the topic of women's health through the ages. And we started this theme last week by talking about raising girls with grace and grit. So I really focused on children and, girls, young women through their adolescence. And I really addressed some of our present day challenges for our young girls and young women. And I really talked about the responsibility that we all have as women in this culture to lead from the front in terms of what it means to respect and honor our mind, body, and soul. And really, that's regardless if you have daughters, right? It's as a culture, I do feel like we have this moral obligation to really be an example to our youth in terms of what we want to see created in our culture. Because the only way our culture is going to grow and sort of release the dogma of the diet culture is if we do start leading by example and we do start bestowing a different belief system on our children and young women. So this week, we are going into the next age bracket, which I believe is really kind of the 20s and 30s. And I call them the building years. Now, I say that, but of course, I believe a woman is focusing on building her life, I hope, throughout her life. But I really do feel like in our 20s and 30s, we are so focused on building careers and building families and building a better understanding of who we are as people. We're trying to figure it all out, right? I feel like it's this real construction phase. And we kind of enter our 20s often kind of feeling like the world is our oyster, right? And we start sort of tacking on responsibilities into our life. And through those responsibilities, our jobs, our families, our homes, our other passions and pursuits, we really start to develop or fortify different behaviors that help us to manage stress. And a lot of those behaviors may be helpful, but many of them are not. And so then what happens is we get into our 40s, 50s, and beyond, and when we're the most stressed out in life because we have the most responsibilities we've ever had, and we wonder why our physiology is so sensitive to stress. And I just want to say here and now, the reason we're so sensitive to stress in our 40s and 50s can be largely dependent on how we treated ourselves in our 20s and 30s. I am not saying that that is the only factor at play, but I do think it has a bearing. In our 20s and 30s, youth is still very much on our side, right? We still have a load of energy. We haven't really felt the physical broken downness that may be happening internally. And we are more resilient to stress in a chemical way because estrogen and progesterone are still a very robust part of our hormonal profile, which is not necessarily the case as we transition into our 40s and 50s, going through perimenopause and menopause. But the truth is that even though we may not be feeling in our 20s and 30s like we're breaking down, often women are just doing a really great job tolerating the impact of mismanaged stress. So what I mean by that is I truly believe that we are developing a lot of physical challenges in our 20s and 30s based on how we live our life. Now, we may not be feeling the full expressed consequence of those choices, but it doesn't mean the breakdown or the disrupted chemistry is not happening. So if you are a woman in that age bracket, knowing that you are not really honoring the needs of your mind, body, and soul, and you're someone who's telling yourself that you're getting away with it, I just want to tell you here and now, you are most certainly not. You just might be tolerating it at a high capacity because of your age and because you just really haven't felt the breakdown yet. And the way that I think about the breakdown, I have brought this up before on the podcast, but I'll bring it up again. I had a mentor of mine years ago tell me that dis-ease in the human body, disease, ultimately develops through a progression. So the progression is that there's little stones thrown at the window, meaning we start getting some indication that we're misaligned. We start getting headaches. We start getting a little bit of PMS. We start not sleeping well at night. We don't recover as well from our workouts, just minor things. And in most cases, people, reach for the Advil. They chalk it up to just, a rough night or a little bit of stress, but they don't really give it much attention. They don't give the little pebbles much attention. And more time goes by, and the lifestyle hasn't really changed. And the body starts to get less tolerant. And so we start getting the stones thrown at the window being our body. And this is really just more obvious breakdown in our physiology. So maybe we start getting sick more often. Our immune system is really, displaying that it's not supporting us well. The small headaches we were getting occasionally are now turning maybe into migraines. The occasional PMS turns into every month suffering through horrendous PMS. We feel more lethargic, almost to the point that we feel debilitated. Those are the stones, right? These are the things that because we've been ignoring the little pebbles, the stones are now coming at us. And in many cases, people will still blow past and just kind of sweep those stones under the rug and not acknowledge them. So again, we still might take over-the-counter medications, we might do a few things, but nothing to really address the root of the problem, which is our lifestyle. And so ultimately what starts to happen often in our 40s and 50s, when our body chemically is not as resilient to stress as it once was, is we really start to break down. We start getting the boulders through the window. And these are the things that are, really game-changing. We get illnesses we don't recover from as easily, autoimmune disorders, right? Cancers. Maybe we go to get a hysterectomy because we cannot seem to resolve these horrific periods. Maybe we're far more reactive than we've ever been and just feel totally out of control about it. And we tell ourselves that, oh, this is just part of the aging process. Yes, it is a part of the aging process if we haven't been caring for ourselves well. And yes, I hear what I'm saying there, by the way. Like a lot of you might say, well, you could still take great care of yourself and get cancer. Absolutely, that's true. But wouldn't you like to know that you've done everything you can possibly do to prevent that from happening? And that's where I say we have a responsibility towards our lifestyle. And so a lot of women are chalking up disrupted chemistry and hardship in their 40s and 50s, and it's all because it's just suddenly happening. And my belief is it's not suddenly happening. It's your body really telling you loud and clear that your total stress load has been way too high for far too long, and now you no longer have the chemistry to help support that, so you can tolerate it at the capacity that you could a few years ago. But it's not that you're all of a sudden experiencing these things. Those things have been in the making for years. And that's really what I'm speaking to today. I really want to speak to the things that I believe we can be doing in our 20s and 30s in order to more gracefully transition through perimenopause and menopause into our 40s and 50s. And again, I'm not saying that if you do all these things that you're still not going to have a few challenges arise. Of course you may. But I do think you're doing yourself a massive service by doing all you can to control your stress earlier in your life, so you aren't in a position living the most stressful part of your life when your chemistry is least able to support it, and also having no lifestyle skills or strategies in place to help you manage your stress. So let's talk about the challenges with the building years, as I call them. So again, the 20s and 30s. A lot of women that I work with in their 20s and 30s often feel like they're supposed to have it all figured out, right? The first job they get is the job they're supposed to stay in for the next 40 years. They're supposed to meet the love of their life by whatever age. They're supposed to have it all sorted out. And of course, that's not true. And when we think that way, we actually don't allow for failure. We don't allow ourselves a change of direction. We don't allow ourselves to experiment and explore, which I think can really hurt our life because we don't really discover who we truly are. I also see a lot of women in their 20s and 30s just taking on way too much because, again, youth is on their side, right? In terms of being very tolerant of higher amounts of stress. And so they don't set boundaries. They truly feel like they can do all things. And worse yet, we have a culture that is conditioning us to believe, as women, we are supposed to be excellent at all things. We're supposed to have incredible careers, not just incredible careers, but by golly, you should have your own business, right? And you should have a rockin' hot body, and you should have the man of your dreams and 2.5 kids and the house in the suburbs, and you should be traveling to Bali, and good God, it goes on and on. And this creates a ton of overwhelm for women, which heavily weighs on their physical and ultimately their mental health. I also think in our 20s and 30s, we're often still experiencing a lot of newness, right? We're getting often into relationships. For some of us, that means marriage. We are, moving to new places, taking on new careers. Many people are starting families. And all of those things can really start to shift our identity, which can be incredibly disorienting. And if we aren't graceful and gentle with ourselves, if we haven't built that into our sort of character to be that way with ourselves, holy cow, can we create a lot of unnecessary turmoil when we go through these major transitions. So here's my advice. If you are someone who is in your 20s and 30s listening to this podcast, I don't think that's largely my population. I think largely the listeners of this show are probably late 30s and beyond. But I still think all of these things are relevant to anyone listening, because chances are you can identify with them regardless of your age, but also you probably have women in your life who are in that age bracket that you are making an impression upon. So just like I talked about in the podcast last week, I think it is our responsibility as women, regardless of our age, to always be leading from the front. And when we can remind ourselves of the struggles and challenges at different ages and stages of life, even if we're past them, it allows us to be better leaders because we can empathize with women in that age group and we can support them more effectively. So here's some of my advice to women in their 20s and 30s. First and foremost, you must extend to yourself buckets of grace. Learn to rest. Learn to set boundaries. Learn to have compassion with yourself. I feel like for me in my 20s and 30s, I was all about grit. I was all about, establishing my career and proving myself and making, all the right decisions I thought were the right decisions and just sort of almost forcing it all to happen. And it cost me a lot. It cost me a lot in terms of energy. Like I spent energy totally unnecessarily. I had to learn in my 30s and 40s why boundaries are so healthy. And I had to really learn how to have compassion with myself later in life because it wasn't something I practiced early on. So again, if you're in your 20s and 30s, I would strongly encourage you to pour upon yourself buckets of grace. I would also say take risks, right? We don't have as many responsibilities when we're younger. And I do think it's such a brilliant time to take big risks, to move across the country, to take that dream job, to maybe start your own business if that's something that's on your heart. Because you really don't feel like you have as much to lose if you fail as you might when you're older. And I'm not using that, by the way, as rationale for any of you who are older listening that have those things on your heart. I would still encourage you to take those risks as well. But I think those of us who are a little bit older can definitely identify that there is a freedom that comes from our youth because we don't have as much responsibility. I would also say to women to get to know yourself in your 20s and 30s, like be introspective. Because when you know yourself better, you can lead yourself better. And when you lead yourself better, you really bring your best to all situations, to all relationships. Your relationship with yourself is the most important one you will ever have. So what I would encourage you to spend a ton of time getting to know yourself. Travel by yourself. Live by yourself. Make time for self-reflection. Stop looking outwards all the time for the world to fulfill you. That's not the world's job. That's your job. It is your job to fulfill you. So I really believe that fulfillment is more an exercise of looking in than looking out. Because you can't go towards the things that you really want if you don't even know what it is that you want. I would also say focus more on who you are becoming than on how you look. Which I know, come on, as women, we all have a vanity bone. We all want to look good. And looks fade. So what is the legacy that you're leaning into? What is the life that you are building? Who are you becoming? Those are great questions to answer. I also want to remind women in their 20s and 30s that you have plenty of time. I know it doesn't feel like it. God, I remember feeling that way in my, at 27, at 37, just feeling like I was against the clock. And I think it caused me to make a lot of rash decisions. It caused a lot of unnecessary stress. And looking back, it just really wasn't a requirement. And it wasn't even true. I had so much time. And even just now, like at almost 43, looking back at just how much has changed for me in the past 3 to 5 years is mind-blowing. So stop being in such a hurry. Really be present with your life right now. Be fully conscious and in your life right now, because you will live it so much better, rather than if you're always trying to live it from the future, right? You're always chasing that next thing. I'll also say here that nothing is as urgent as you make it seem. And I'll give you a great example of this. When I had my son, I had a personal training facility. And I don't remember how much time I took off after the birth of my son, which I had a very traumatic birth. I had a wonderful, beautiful, natural birth, but I hemorrhaged afterwards, and I had to have a blood transfusion, and I was in the hospital for days, and it took a lot out of me physically, literally. And I had never had a child before. I had never had a surgery before or had any kind of medical trauma like that in my life. And yet I still told myself I had to be back at work within 3 weeks. So literally 3 weeks after I had my son, I was pumping at 4 o'clock in the morning and I was training people at 5 a.m. And looking back, that was absolutely absurd. And I think it was borderline self-abuse. But I really wish another woman had stepped in. An older, wiser woman had stepped in and said to me, don't do this. But nobody did. And probably because I have a very strong personality. I'm definitely not, criticizing the women in my life for not doing that. But this is why I say we need to lead from the front, and we need to mentor and support the women who are younger than us, because they really just don't know. And sometimes what they need is just the voice of reason to say, hey, look, I've been there. You went through a lot. Give yourself the grace of a little bit more time. So to those of you who are not in your 20s and 30s, I just want to remind you that in those building years, as women are discovering who they are and what they want in their life, I do think that they could use a lot more support and a lot more honest conversations and a lot more sharing of stories about what you wish you had maybe done differently based on what you know now. So be the mentor, right? Continue to lead from the front. To this day, I always joke with my husband, but it's not really a joke, that a lot of you have heard me say that some women just, gracefully transition into motherhood, and I really transitioned into motherhood like a tsunami. It was not graceful. It was intense. It was ugly. I was definitely not just a naturally graceful mother. And I see pregnant women now, and I really want to go up to them and just put my hand on their shoulder and just say, it's going to be okay. You're going to figure it out. Because when I was pregnant, women just were constantly, oh, you look so cute, and what's the baby's name going to be? And it was all just rainbows and unicorns, right? Focusing on all the beautiful parts of having a baby and being pregnant. But man, do I think we're doing women a massive disservice when we don't talk about some of the hardship and struggle. I'm not saying scare the, living daylights out of them. That's not necessary. But just honest conversation. Honest conversation about staying in a job that you might have stayed in for too long because you were afraid of taking a risk. staying in a toxic relationship because you didn't really understand setting boundaries and you were always people pleasing. Like, these are the stories I feel like young women could benefit from hearing, and yet we're so, I think, often ashamed of sharing them. And we need to get over that, because really the shame is not doing anybody any good. It's not letting you move past it, and it's not letting someone else learn from it. And I think by sharing, that's how we kind of get rid of it, right? And we can let it go and we can drop that weight. So again, I asked this last week and I'll ask this now. If a woman in her 20s and 30s was watching you as an example, what would she be learning about self-respect and self-love and self-leadership? I think that's a really powerful question to consider. So next week, I want to talk about the renovation years. And that's how I look at that's how I look at the 40s and even the 50s, is like this renovation. This is largely the population that I work with. And I have gone through this, and I'm still going through this in my own life, where, my 20s and 30s, I built up, I accomplished so many things. I sort of built what I thought was a fulfilling life. And in many ways it is. And in some ways it isn't. And to be able to look around at the life that I've built and really be so grateful for the parts that I love and serve me well, and be willing to be very honest about the parts that aren't, and even take it further and be willing to renovate those parts, I think that's what makes really our 40s and 50s so magical. It's scary as hell. It's not easy. But I think we start to get an opportunity to reinvent ourselves based on what we've learned about ourselves in our 20s and 30s. So that's what I'm going to lean into next week. Definitely not talking here as if I have it all figured out. I certainly don't. But being a woman who's traveled through these age groups, and certainly working with bucket loads of women in these age groups, I just feel like this is a really important conversation to be having. So I hope you're getting a lot of value from these episodes this month. I'd love to hear your feedback. You can always head on over to gracefully.com, and you can always leave me an email at Courtney@gracefully.com about what you're getting value from, what you want to hear more of. But definitely your feedback is always very helpful. So I hope you have a magnificent day, and I will be back next week with more of this conversation about women's health through the ages. And next week, we will be leaning into that renovation stage. All right, my friends, take care. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to the Grace and Grit podcast. It is time to mend the fabric of the female health story, and it starts with you taking radical responsibility for your own self-care. You are worth the effort, and with a little grace and grit, anything is possible.